Also, yeah. Okay. I think we'll just start anyway. Sorry for the delay. We're just waiting a little bit for some students of ours to arrive. They're for the excursion at the Villa Borghese, but they are just coming in, dripping in now. And I'll start the introduction. Thanks for coming. So first of all, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Matthijs Jonker. I'm the Director of Studies in Art History here at the Institute, the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome, the KNIR. And I'm also coordinator of this seminar series, the KNIR Research Dialogues, which we started 2 years ago in 2021. And the idea of the Research Dialogues is that we invite scholars who work on projects closely related to the themes and the profile of the Institute, and to have them present work in progress and engage in hopefully stimulating discussions with the KNIR community, indeed a dialogue. And thus far the main theme has been Italian coloniality, and we purposely define this theme very broadly so that it can cover Italy's role in various colonization and decolonization processes from antiquity to the 20th century or even 21st century. And this also includes Italy's virtual discovery of the New World in the early modern period. And in that context, well, I want to introduce our speaker of tonight. And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Sergio Botta. Sergio is an associate professor in the history of religions at the Department of History, Anthropology, Religions, Arts, and Performing Arts at La Sapienza, the University of Rome. He obtained his PhD in the history of religions from the same university, and he spent several periods as a visiting fellow and research fellow in Mexico, Guatemala, Spain, and England. And his main research interests are indigenous religions of the Americas, and especially Mesoamerica, method and theory in the study of religions, and religions and arts. And currently is working on a monograph about the Franciscan discourse regarding Mesoamerican gods in the 16th century, New Spain. In addition, he is working with Guillaume Olivier on a new edition of the Codex Vaticanus Latinus 3738, also known as the Codex Rios or the Codice Vaticano. And we'll hear more about that in his talk tonight. He's also deputy editor of the study of the journal Studi e Materiali di Storia delle Religioni. And among his many publications, I just want to mention a couple of his books. Religione e Conquista, Saggi sul discorso coloniale in Mexico from 2008. Manufacturing Otherness, Missions and Indigenousness, Indigenous Cultures in Latin America from 2013. And a recent article, which is called Incorporating Mesoamerican Cosmology Within a Global History of Religion, Some Considerations on the Work of Lorenzo Pignoria. And that was published in Reshaping the World, Debates on Mesoamerican Cosmologies, edited by Ana Diaz. And that's also related to the theme of tonight's talk. And tonight's title is The Assimilation of Mesoamerican Gods in a Visual Theory of Religion. And please, Sergio, come forward and give us your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you today and with everything online. I would like to thank Matthijs Jonker and the board of KNIR for this kind invitation. It's really an honor to present this ongoing research on Lorenzo Pignoria in this academy. Let me briefly introduce myself, my scientific profile, just to elucidate the way I prepare the speech. I'm using a text, not to pass my time. First, I'm an historian of religion, and I'm mainly interested in the way in the Western and modern construction of the very concept of religion itself. And second, I have been working on religious encounters in the New World, especially in New Spain, And as Marty said, in the last few years, I focused my research on the Franciscan representation and discourse on ancient American gods during 16th and 17th centuries. So my research interests on one side in the analytical category on the study of religions, and on the other side on the history of indigenous culture, maybe it's converging in a reflection on a general concept of polytheism and the way it is used in the context of the interpretation of these gods. Indeed, polytheism is a sort of paradoxical analytical category in the study of religion. Historically, the term comes from Greek language, obviously, but the concept was never used by Greeks themselves to define or to denote their religious beliefs and practices. Likewise, polytheism was rarely used as a term in ancient history. In any case, it was merely used by monotheistic, it means Judeo-Christian literary sources, such as in Philo of Alexandria, reflecting on the nature of idolatry of non-monotheistic peoples. So we could say that essentially polytheism is a modern concept, shaped by European intellectuals starting from the second half of the 16th century. On the one hand, within the theological controversy within Catholic and Reformed Christianity, and on the other hand, to describe religions of the others. It served as a sort of epistemological and comparative instruments to understand at the same time all this historical data coming from the rediscovery of ancient religions, and on the other side, on all those data coming from the many religions of the new worlds that had recently appeared during early modern history. So from this perspective, I would like to present an example of the need to understand and at the same time to assimilate religious differences during this first part of modern history. I will focus on the work of an antiquarian, Lorenzo Pignoria, who at the beginning of the 17th century proposed an original reflection on the nature of the gods of these new worlds, trying to elaborate a sort of unusual, we could say, visual theory of polytheism and religion at the same time. The main goal of this speech is to exemplify how an indigenous cosmology, including in a renowned codex, the Codex Vaticanus Latinus 3738, also identified as Codex Vaticanus A or Codex Rios, which is nowadays hosted in the Apostolic Vatican Library, was incorporated by the European antiquarian culture to promote a sort of Christian assimilation of indigenous worldviews and the construction of a global theory and history of religion. The Codex Vaticanus A was manufactured in Mexico, probably on Italian commission, by a group of Dominican friars and indigenous painter around 1562 and 1564. Certainly, it was in the Vatican Library at the end of the century, as attested by the Rinaldi inventory of the Vatican collection, which was compiled between 1596 and 1601. The codex was probably brought in Rome by the Dominican friar Juan de Córdoba, as Davide Domenici showed some years ago, before 1566. In fact, Pignoria himself explained that he could observe some reproduction or folios of the Mexican idols contained in the codex through the mediation of the Senator Malipiero Ottaviano, which was in Venice at that time, who had received them from the Cardinal Marco Antonio d'Amulio, known as the Amulio, the latter which has been prefect of the Vatican Library between 1565 and 1566. The Codex is the only colonial manuscript to feature a lengthy and systematically composed Italian text, many Italian glosses, written for an Italian audience, probably in the church, to describe and clarify a large number of indigenous pictographic images produced by indigenous painters. It is a complex manuscript divided into partially autonomous sections that contain some description of two different calendars, the large 365 days calendar and another divinatory calendar of 260 days, a long account of the history of the Aztecs, an ethnographic section which was focused on warriors and clothes, etc. But first of all, the first section of the Codex is dedicated to a cosmological description that Pignoria will have been consulting at the beginning of the 17th century, which is part of this important text. I will focus on a group of appendices that, starting from 1615, Lorenzo Pignoria headed to a famous mythographic work produced by Vincenzo Cartari, which has been published for the first time in Venice in 1556, under the title of Le immagini con la sposizione dei dei degli antichi. This work was originally composed to collect images of ancient Greek and Roman gods. It was one of the most important iconographic and mythographic treatises devoted to pagan gods, which contributed to the dissemination of a renewed knowledge. It represented the culmination of a Renaissance interest in classical antiquity that developed from the works such as the Genealogia Deorum Gentilium by Giovanni Boccaccio. During the second half of the 16th century, Cartari's work was extremely popular throughout Europe, as it was translated was written originally in Italian and then translated into Latin, English, French, German, etc. Aiming to investigate ancient gods, it paradoxically, the work of Cartari paradoxically represented the triumph of a textual culture. Even though Cartari's purpose was to provide to European artists with a wide iconographic repertoire, the first edition of his work did not contain any image and only relied on literary sources. It is only starting with the Venetian second edition of 1571, Le immagini degli dei degli antichi, that 98 depictions were produced by the painter Bolognino Zaltieri, who, nevertheless, was inspired by the Cartari's text to produce his drawings. Cartari died in 1581 at the beginning of a renewed interest for ancient and new pagan gods. So while he was still successful in Europe at that time, Cartari's treatise required a new sort of organization and a broader repertoire of images of gods. A first revised edition was then published in 1608 by Cesare Malfatti, containing a brief addition to the text that points to a new interest in the surprising appearance of what we should call modern polytheisms. After a few years, editor Pietro Paolo Tozzi commissioned Lorenzo Pignoria a new collection of images and the production of 2 appendices to Cartari's work in order to compare ancient gods with idols coming from Asia and the Americas. Pignoria was born in Padua in 1571, was educated in a Jesuit environment, and he joined the circle of the humanist Gian Vincenzo Pinelli, whose library was at that time one of the most famous in the whole Europe. Here, Pignoria was in contact with many important protagonists of Italian humanist culture, such as Paolo Gualdo, who has been Pinelli's secretary, Nicolas-Claude Fabri de Peiresc, Galileo Galilei, Torquato Tasso, and so on. In 1602, Pignoria was consecrated priest by the Bishop of Padua, Marco Corner, who wanted him as a secretary in 1605. In 1605, Corner took Pignoria with him to Rome, where he could see many of the ancient objects that were described in some of his later works. When in Rome, Pignoria met the Cardinal Cesare Baronio, to whom he dedicated a commentary on the so-called Mensa Isiaca, or Tavola Bambina, a Roman Egyptian bronze table, so known because it was probably part of the collection of the Cardinal Pietro Bembo. We will talk about Mensa Isiaca later. When he returned to Padua, he resumed his priestly occupation and refused a chair in Pisa, which was offered by Galileo Galilei, as he wanted to devote the last year of his life to study and writing. In 1630, he obtained a canonry in Treviso and finally died in 1631. While researching ancient and modern gods, Pignoria built a complex and wide network of correspondence, among which are Galilei, Peiresc, Hervart, Girolamo Leandro, Cardinal Francesco Barberini, etc. From the correspondence with Galileo, it appears that around 1612, Pignoria was already looking for any information related to Indian idols, not only Egyptian idols, but also Indians, Chinese, Japanese, Burmese, from other regions of the East Indies, and also Peruvian, Mexican, and from New Spain as well. Then Pignoria contributed to 3 new editions of Cartari's treatise, published respectively in 1615, 1626, and 1647. He added new images manufactured by the engraver Filippo Ferroverde, which replaced those by Zaltieri. The new edition of Pignoria was infused with a new original interest in visual sources and in collecting antiquities, an expression of that kind of empiricism of the antiquarian culture which was emerging at the beginning of the 17th century. In these 2 appendices, Pignoria inserted many vere e reali immagini dedicated to classical antiquity through the description of ancient artifacts, statues, figurines, coins, cameos, and any kind of exotic objects, selecting from his collection and from those he had been able to observe directly in Padua, in Rome, and in France, and thanks to many of these correspondents and friends. This first section embodies what Peter Burke called a visual turn that expresses a sort of unique use of material object and images. Beside the appendices represented a new way of writing a sort of historia sacra, a new history of religion, with combining textual evidence with numismatics and eyewitness description, completely changed the view of the past at that time. Pignoria marks a total break with respect to Cartari's treatise. While the latter based his work on the descriptive power of words and literature, Pignoria paid more attention to visual aspect and established an analytical methodology, a way of what was called by Paolo von Visgiocosa, investigating religion visually. Pignoria's main contribution to the study of Mesoamerican cosmology is a second appendix devoted to the description of Mexican, Indian, and Japanese gods, the seconda parte delle immagini degli dei degli indiani. This new section, dedicated to what, according to Bork, might be called alternative antiquities, is of great importance as it extends the focus of the gods to the whole world, reflecting a new comparative urgency at the beginning of the 17th century. As the images from India and Japan, Pignoria based his analysis on objects directly observed thanks to European collector, as well on data achieved from Jesuit accounts. However, the sources of the appendix that Pignoria devoted to the gods of New World had a different origin. The American section of the 1615 edition is composed of 12 depictions. Among these, 7 drawings are copies of images contained in the already mentioned Codex Vaticanus A. In the 1626 edition, Pignoria added one more illustration taken from the same codex. It's a figure of the god Quetzalcoatl, which corresponds to the folio 31 recto, and was not depicted after a direct consultation of the codex, but thanks to an engraving by Philippe van Winge, which was contained in a manuscript hosted nowadays in the Bibliotheca Angelica of Rome, which is another very interesting manuscript that I cannot describe now in this context. Among other engravings of the American section, 2 idols were copied from images sent by to Pignoria by the scholar of Egyptian arts and antiquities Hans-Georg Hervart, who collected them from the Kunstkammer of the Duke of Bavaria in Munich. The first of these images has been considered somewhat problematic by commentators, but then I will see them at the end of my presentation. Finally, Pignoria inserted in this section 3 Egyptian and classical images that didn't constitute a direct source for ethnographic understanding of Mesoamerican religion, but still play a key role, as we will note, in the assimilation of the cosmology contained in the Codex Vaticanus A. The Mexican corpus is composed of 7 images and texts both partially taken from the Codex. At page 5 of this, the first edition, pictorial depicts an image of the Mexican god called Omeyoca. While at the page 7, the same god is recognized as Ometeotl. It's a proof that Pignoria doesn't know anything about Mesoamerican culture and Mesoamerican languages. Illustration and glosses came from the well-known folio Uno Verso of the Codex Vaticano, but there are many controversial usage of this information, as we will see soon. In the following section, after having some images coming from Egypt, Pignoria draws 4 double images from the folio 2 verses of the Codex that represent 4 pairs of underworld gods, and then another image of a messenger of the god Tlalotonac, and finally an image of Quetzalcoatl, then 2 other American idols. Scholarly repeatedly underline the accidental or unintended order and the subjective selection of images that Pignoria acquired from the Codex. However, it should be not underestimated the fact that all the images selected by him came from the cosmological section, from the first part of the Codex Vaticanus A. This first part of the Codex already presented a sort of Christian effort to assimilate indigenous worldview. Pignoria collected those images directed from the Codex and reconsidered the hybrid cosmology that was produced by Dominican friars there, and taken a step toward definitive appropriation of indigenous religion. This new cosmology proposed by Pignoria delivered a real global representation of idolatry. Pignoria's discourse on gods and idolatry in general opens with a sort of an Egyptogenetic argument that aims to propose a sort of comprehensive history of religion, in which Egypt is conceived as the place of origin of all superstition. Pignoria affirmed a sort of diffusionist theory of idolatry based on the authority of Herodotus, who had suggested the prominence of Egyptian culture in antiquity. Of course, Pignoria offered a negative view of Egypt from a religious point of view, drawing a clear line between true and false religion, as he tried to keep the history of religion within the framework of a Christian Historia Sacra. As we will notice, Pignoria also exposed a sort of visual methodology based on an original use of images and objects. As an expert on Egyptian iconography, he sought for similarity with Mexican idols, exploring the existence of a global conformita, a sort of conformity, not only between Egypt and Mexico, but to write a global history of all religions. Emphasizing the resemblance between Mexican and Egyptian gods, Pignoria opened his large description with a portrait of the god Omeyoca, Ometeotl, is using different names, which is explicitly compared to the Roman Jupiter. This effort to relate Mexican and Roman god is obviously not present in the Codex Vaticanus A. However, the comparison does not encourage a positive evaluation of Mesoamerican religion. On the contrary, Pignoria produced a completely negative theological judgment. The image of Omeyoca provides a clear expression of the methodology of Pignoria's methodology. To demonstrate the existence of a conformity of Mesoamerican gods to the general idea of what a god should be, the Egyptian model, Pignoria suggests a visual comparison that produces a transformation of the original image taken from the Codex Vaticanus A. First, Pignoria isolates the god from his original context, eradicating the representation of the cosmos, which was a fundamental feature of the representation contained in the folio Uno Versus of the Codex. In the manuscript, a narrative sequence organized into three different pages show a sort of vertical representation of the cosmos divided into 3 levels. We could see only the first part of this representation of the cosmos here. It depicts the Aztec cosmos as a sort of division into 13 celestial layers, and on the other side on 9 levels of the underworlds, which is in the other page of the Codex. Of course, Pignoria did not aim to represent an authentic Mesoamerican worldview, but it persistently pursued the path of a Christianization of the indigenous cosmology. First, it reproduced some data taken from the glosses of the Codex, which had already proposed a theological discussion of the cosmological context on these images. Second, Pignoria definitely transformed the original vertical representation of the cosmos contained in the Codex into a sort of horizontal and chronological history. Homoyoga is transformed into a creator god who opens the road by analogy with the biblical accounts with a historia sacra, for a rewriting of a large theological account of Mesoamerican history. Through a visual methodology, the Mexican god can be conveyed within a global history of religion. Pignoria applies his Egyptian comparative theory by inserting 2 medallions of Isis and Osiris, which obviously are not included in the Codex, in the original Codex, alongside the representation of Homoyoga. These 2 figures were taken from the already mentioned Mensa Isiaca, which was an Egyptianizing Roman bronze table, probably dated from the reign of Emperor Claudius, and unearthed in Europe in Rome around 1520. Pignoria had studied the Mensa Isiaca in 1605 and took from that those images that would later appear in the appendix of Cartari's work. This example of visual empiricism allowed Pignoria to prove his own hypothesis. The images taken from the altar of Isis were compared to Homoyoga in such a way that on the one hand, all the idols resemble one another in their kneeling posture, and on the other, the overall composition bears a formal similarity to Egyptian images of God. As a result, the interpretation of these images produced a step forward toward a sort of colonial semiosis started by the Dominican friars who wrote the glosses of the Codex. While here, the theological discussion was the product of a complex negotiation between Christian texts and indigenous images, Pignoria proposed a more effective theological intrusion. To confirm the hypothesis concerning the Egyptian origin of the posture of the body of the gods, Pignoria has an image of Isis and Osiris that he personally had observed in the Mensa Isiaca, confirming his comparative hypothesis based on the universal conformity of gods, gestures, and bodies. Later, Pignoria expounded a sort of brief genealogy of Mexican gods. Recovering the text of the Codex Vaticanus A, he enhanced the potential analogy with biblical accounts and showing that Homoyoga generated, after the flood, Sipactonal and his wife Oshomoko interpreted as they were a sort of Mesoamerican Adam and Eve. Then at the pages, then at the pages 9 and between 9 and 12 are depicted 4 different pairs of gods, which were taken from the folio 2 verses of the Codex Vaticanus A, and are described in detail in the glosses of the folio 3 rect. The illustration of the 4 pairs follow a completely distinct order in Pignoria's work, which only mention the name of male gods and trying to associate them with underworld classical deities. The next 2 images represent a step forward, a theological interpretation of Mesoamerican religion. The first one, at page 14, is a representation of a divine messenger announcing the birth of the famous god Quetzalcoatl. This image reveals a profound transformation, both visually and textually, compared to that included in the folio 7 recto of the Codex Vaticanus A. Again, Pignoria produced a strong decontextualization of this messenger of the god Citlalatonach included in the codex. The isolation, again, of the figure from its original pictographic context provoked the elimination of the original meaning of these mythological episodes, described in the glosses of the codex as a sort of ceremony of flowers that would take place during the fourth age, the age of the goddess Xochiquetzal, which is personage here. On the one hand, the representation loses any connection to mythical events, as shown by the disappearance, for example, of flowers, which is the main symbol of Xochiquetzal, which is a god related to flowers, from the end of the messenger of the god. On the other hand, the body of the messenger has been rotated by 90 degrees by Pignoria, thus producing a figure rushing with outstretched arms from left to right, which would immediately remind any viewer familiar to Christian iconography to the Annunciation of the birth of Christ. It is worth noticing that a symmetrical change also take place on textual level. Once again, Pignoria follows the text of the Codex Vaticanus A, summarizing it and eliminating every data connecting to mythological Indian subjects. He extends his interpretation of this sort of miraculous birth of Quetzalcoatl by explicitly identifying the messenger with the Archangel Gabriel. But Pignoria also places a strong emphasis on the demonic, demonic imitation, as was not done by the friars in the Codex, by citing a passage from the second letter of Paul to Corinthians. Satanas transfiguratur in angelum lucis. Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Through the usage of these polemical arguments against the pseudo-apostles by Paul, Pignoria rejects any possible Neoplatonic interpretation of this curious account of the birth of Quetzalcoatl. The following images of Quetzalcoatl himself in his manifestation of God of the Winds, Hecatl, becomes the cornerstone of Pignoria's Historia Sacra. The image and the text reproduce the corresponding representation contained in the folio 7 verses of the Codex Vaticanus A. Comparing the text of the Codex, there is only some minor changes in Pignoria's discourse, a selection of information, and of course, a lack of knowledge in Nahuatl language. However, there are, again, significant changes produced by Pignoria on a visual ground. On the one hand, Quetzalcoatl is one more isolated from his original pictographic context. On the other hand, some subtle differences in the depiction of the god that Pignoria introduces are really important. For instance, if we look at the incensory to the right of the god, it can be noticed that Filippo Ferroverde added a cross. I don't know if you can see here. That was absent in the Codex. This curious novelty carries Pignoria's discourse on an extremely challenging ground. Far from being a simple reproduction of the Codex, Pignoria's image hides a complex epistemological operation, which acts through subtle interventions to incorporate Mexican images into a Christian theological interpretation. Pignoria promotes the decisive transition of its Historia Sacra, describing 4 reasons once again, of visual nature that justify its comparative efforts. In the first place, the antiquarian noted the presence of addresses that he considered as a demonic object, which could also be found in classical ceremonies. The second and the third elements of the depiction are the litus that Quetzalcoatl carries in his right hand and that resemble those of Roman ogres, and the cornucopia that the Mexican used as an incensory and that could be encountered in classical legends. Finally, the fourth element, which means the presence of the crosses, is obviously crucial to propose an original discourse comparing to the description of Quetzalcoatl contained in the Codex. Apparently, the presence of the crosses could have been interpreted as a sign of a sort of pre-Hispanic preparation for the gospel. But in this direction, Pignoria sought for other historical evidence about pre-colonial presence of Christian crosses in the New World, as reading Benzoni, Las Casas, etc. But it closes his large discussion with the doubts. We could believe really in a presence of Christianity in pre-Hispanic America. However, at the end of this large discussion, he carefully used his antiquarian empiricism to deny every possibility to support the assumption of a pre-Hispanic preparatio evangelica. On the contrary, he warned the readers that the presence of crosses in the New World reminded him of a rare and similar cross that he had noticed on a coin of the Emperor Constantine. Therefore, the comparison with the Constantinian cross serves mainly as a rhetorical instrument to complete his Historia Sacra. Then the antiquarian added an image of Constantine crowned by victory along with his motto, "In this sign will you triumph," which gives the definitive meaning to the assimilation of Mesoamerican cosmology into a Christian genealogy. So the birth of Quetzalcoatl do not represent a sign of a possible philosophia perennis, and in Pignoria's view does not authorize any Neoplatonic possibility of producing a narrative of salvation in pre-Hispanic Americas. It was only a sign of the demonic imitation of the true divine life of Christ. So that the present on Constantine in Pignoria Historia Sacra rather represent a sort of theological and political recapitulation of the history of the inclusion of every form of paganism. Constantine epitomized the founding image of a dominion over the entire world, of the final conversion of the pagans and the destruction of all idols. If Constantine was primus imperatorum Christianae fide propagator, Pignoria uses his image to finally incorporate Mesoamerican idolatry into a Christian theological and political worldview. To conclude, I would like to show you how Pignoria proceeded in the display of two other American idols, which do not belong to the Codex, to the corpus of the images taken from the Codex Vaticanus A. In these two images, is it possible to appreciate how Pignoria experiment with Homo Ioca resulted in a sort of visual methodology that can be reproduced ad libitum. The first depiction represents an idol that Pignoria obtained from the Kunstkammer of the Duke of Bavaria, thanks to Herbert mediation. Here, the antiquarian compared two figures taken from completely different contexts. The main image is once again taken from the Mensa Isiaca. There it is. And depicts a figure in a standing position wearing having a particular bird, which analogically grounds the comparability with the American idol. In the lower left margin of the pages, Pignoria had a sort of a small American image that would represent, according to him, again, a Mexican idol. The identification of the figure is still controversial today, although it's probably a wooden idol from Florida, but it's not important in this context. What is worth noticing here is that precisely the presence of this comparable bird in both figures that would confirm Pignoria diffusionist hypothesis. Finally, the image of a second idol at the end of the American section is also mistakenly identified by Pignoria as a Mexican idol, as Mexico is sort of an attractor to every images coming from the America at that time. Nowadays, the image has been recognized as a depiction of a Zemi from the Taino culture. However, Pignoria once again proves its tried and tested methodology, which proceed by comparing this American character, once again with an image taken from the Mensa Isiaca, that on the upper left side of the page, that is the Cercopithecus of Egypt. These two comparisons placed immediately after the conclusion of the Storia Sacra prove the endless extensibility of this visual methodology that systematically proceeds by recovery from an alleged Egyptian tradition, the tools for the translation of any religious differences. These theoretical proposals, which establish the comparability with the gods and the potential conformity between the postures of their bodies, fail to impose a paradigmatic model during this part of modern history, but represent, however, an early attempt to construct a global theory of polytheism that reveals, however, the need to neutralize the ethnographic differences that the old world aspired to understand by including them in a global definition of religion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sergio, for this great talk, very rich talk. And there's much to think about, I think, and fascinating material that you discussed, fascinating examples. Yeah, I want to see if there are any questions already or comments at this point from people here in the audience, but also maybe on Zoom. If there are questions on Zoom, then please use the raise hand function there. Can I already give someone the first question? People still thinking? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful paper. My own background is in Egyptology, and so I'm very interested about Neoplatonic interpretations of ancient Egyptian deities and the opposite of total condemnation within the same period. So I'm wondering, was he, with his negative approach towards Mesoamerican religion, completely representative, or were there also similar attempts like later Athanasius Kircher did with the Egyptian religion to read Mesoamerican religion as an expression of something like a philosophia perennis? Thank you.
Yeah, there are many scholars who are trying to establish a sort of link between Pignoria and Kircher. I'm not definitely sure if Kircher used Pignoria in his works is problematic, but I know that there's a German scholar, Margit Kern, who wrote an article trying to propose a Neoplatonic interpretation of Pignoria as reading of the text. I try to answer her, but I think that, I mean, there's a footnote in her article which said Pignoria was actually a Neoplatonic, but I'm quoting freely, but he cannot openly express his standpoint, his point of view, because of the problems with Neoplatonic cultures in Padua at that time. Well, could be, but it's complicated. It's complicated to look at this process in absence of a formal expression of Neoplatonic perspective. And Pignoria is, in different part of his text, is completely against Neoplatonic interpretation of this context, and is completely coherent with the theological context where Pignoria is studying, which is an Aristotelian Jesuitic context in Padua, which is totally and completely against Neoplatonic culture at that time. I mean, there is a very important struggle at the beginning of the 17th century in that context. And Pignoria is during all his life, it's clearly recognized as a I could say an orthodox Aristotelian, and it's always in the text struggling against a Neoplatonic point of view. I mean, it's definitely repeated 3 or 4 times in the text. This is not a philosophia perennis. This is it is a diabolic imitation of the history of Christ. So it's an idolatic history of the widespread of idolatry from all over the world. So.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, comments, or people at home? Go, Carlo.
Thank you for your paper. Maybe there is no answer to this question, but do you see this as an attempt to create a cosmology, or also as a way to explain what they had in the Codex?
Of course, from their point of view, they're trying to explain. But what does it mean, explain for them? It's obviously explain is to assimilate in a paradigm. I mean, which is the Historia Sacra, which is the history of salvation. Everything should converge in the history of conversion, for the good or the bad. I mean, it's a diabolic imitation of the history of conversion, and we have to assimilate pagan religions and to convert pagan religion to Christianize the whole world. There's no possibility here to a real ethnographic form of comprehension of indigenous religion. And the problem is Pignoria has a very limited knowledge of Americas, limited into brackets. It's a general knowledge. It's a very limited knowledge of Nawa religion, because it doesn't have sources at that point of time. Many of the most important sources that we nowadays have to study Mesoamerican religions is the first one. The most important one is the Florentine Codex by Bernardino de Sahagún, were not written at that time, were written in the last part of the century and were completely hidden till the end of the 19th century. So he has very few elements, and the only elements he has were from the Codex, but the Codex was already a very strong form of negotiation between a group of Dominican friars writing probably to the Pope, they are trying to show that there are some good possibility for the conversion of indigenous people, showing that there are some kind of similarity between indigenous cosmology and Christian theology. But that was a sort of dialogue that was produced very quickly during the production of the Codex, that was probably produced in 2 or 3 years. Part of the Codex was copied by another Codex that was now in France, but not the first part, not the first cosmological part is not in the Codex Stellariano-Remensis. And they probably tried to produce a sort of text that could appeal to the interest of the Pope at that time. But Pignoria is completely changing. Why? Well, it's using some subtle changes in the text, is moving towards a complete negative judgment of what Mesoamerican cosmology is, and comparing with the source of all idolatry, which is Egypt, which is a subtle change, because it's copying the text, but it's just adding some data, is trying to add this comparison with Egypt, this comparison with Roman gods, etc. But it's completely changed the meaning of the entire discourse. I mean, it's in a way, it's a way of trying of understand what cosmology of indigenous cosmology is at that time. I think we cannot expect an anthropological sense See, yeah, an anthropological way of working and of thinking in first part of early modern history, I think.
Yeah, if I may follow up a little bit, yeah, because I know there is no answer to this question, but I was interested in the way he compared details. So the question is whether there is enough material to think that he created a sort of mnemosine atlas kind of comparison, looking at details in order to study the codex.
Yeah, that's I don't know if it's really studying the codex actually. For example, when Pignoria and Ferroverde had this little cross on the cornucopia, which is not present there, it's clearly a sort of, how could I say, a sort of process of imagination, because they saw crosses, but crosses is not, it's such a general symbol in different culture, which could have completely different meanings in Mesoamerica and in the old worlds. But seeing something that could remind a Christian cross, then Ferroverde and Pignoria started with an invention, putting a cross where it doesn't appear in the codex, and from there commenting the presence of the cross in the cornucopia. Pignoria started with 3 pages of discussion about the presence of crosses in the Americas, which was a very important topic at that time. Benzoni wrote about that. Bartolomé de las Casas, of course, is trying to propose the presence of crosses previous the arrival of the first missionary orders, to show that the indigenous people are ready to be Christianized and evangelized. So is actually not really studying the codex, is trying to do something with the codex, which is in his perspective, it's probably could be seen as a study of the codex, but not in our sensibility now, I think.
Thank you very much. The study of religion or religions can also undermine, in the end, of course, the exclusivity of the Christian religion. More than 100 years later, you have David Hume, who writes in the Natural History of Religion that polytheism was basic, was primitive, was earlier than monotheism. Monotheisms grew out of polytheism. Now, that sort of sentiment, I suppose, you cannot expect in the time that Pignoria was working. But do you see any kind of, even though it's very, very perhaps hidden or any sort of sentiment that the study of many world religions can relativize what was thought as the true Christian faith, perhaps not with Pignoria, but perhaps with others that he was, because in the about your lecture there were other names like the Peiresc and others and so on. So I don't know anything about this, but I'm just interested in whether there was already the idea that it might also be dangerous in the end to study religions.
It is dangerous, yeah. Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Actually, I was trying I'm trying to write a book, write a book on the discourse of Franciscan missionary on Mesoamerican gods during a large period. My idea is that otherwise polytheism as a concept is actually only a problem within European history. Started from Jean Baudin, 1580. That's the first modern appearance of the term in Europe, describing in a polemical sense what Christian saint cult is from his perspective. till 1757, I mean, the first general theory of polytheism in David Hume, Natural History of Religion. There are 2 centuries where polytheism was a sort of byproduct of a very strong and heated debate against Reform and Catholic Christianity. But at the same time, there are data coming from other parts of the world, which are the material on which all these intellectuals are speaking on. And they are thinking, I mean, they are speaking and thinking about these things to reflect on the very nature of Christianity at that time. And one of the results is exactly what you said now, is the progressive form of relativization of the very truth of Christianity. I mean, it's the sort of dismantling of the possibility of writing an Historia Sacra based on only Christian values and Christian ideas. It's a sort of collective, very slow process that obviously is point of arrival, if you could say in the point of arrival. It's some texts of the 18th century, such as David Hume, Natural History of Religion, but at the same time, the text that Voltaire wrote for the encyclopedia, one on idols, another on polytheism itself. No, it is not Voltaire and polytheism, but they are text connected, which is trying to produce for the first time a possibility of looking at all this different kind of behavior, human behavior, from a natural point of view and not from a theological point of view. But it is a sort of a slow dismantling of Christian hegemony on the discourse of religion.
Perhaps an earlier phase might be seen in Thomas Hobbes' Divine.
Yeah, sure.
Sitting on the grave of
Yeah.
So the study of Roman religion is just can open up the idea that Christianity is just one of those religions, appropriating all kinds of things from pagan.
Yeah.
So that's already earlier, right?
Yeah, it's already it's between the 16th century till the end of the 18th century. There's a large process with many different philosophical perspectives. But the result, it's the possibility of producing a discourse on religion which is non-theological. I mean, it is just this, and which is the beginning of the scientific study of religion, if we would like to say something like that. Of course, Hobbes and as part of this process, and many others. And in France, there's a large debate around the possibility of thinking the relation between atheism, monotheism, and polytheism, which born first. At the beginning, the man is atheist or is polytheist or monotheist. It's a very many things at stake in that debate at that time. But what is partly was not studied enough, in my opinion, is that we are only looking at that process from within the philosophical debates. But the philosophical debate is nurtured by data coming from the words. And it's a sort of back and forth of the discussion. I mean, there are many data coming from different angles, different corners of the world that are nurturing this discussion. And it's very interesting to look at the way changing, the way Voltaire is thinking at what polytheism and monotheism is. And it's a fascinating circulation of knowledge at that time of modern history.
We have a question over here, Susanna de Beer.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about the process of assimilation or of appropriation, as you mentioned, that is at work in Pignoria's text and images. If I look at your examples, there seems to be a kind of tension between, on the one hand, assimilating the Mesoamerican gods with other polytheisms, so Egyptian gods or maybe Roman and Greek gods. In itself, interesting that sort of incoming data from other parts of the world are compared to data from the past. I think that's in itself interesting, but there's also, I think, more on a larger scale, the process of assimilation with the possibility to appropriate this religion in Christianity, which is the opposite of the polytheisms which with they are compared. And I was wondering, do you see that tension as well, or does it work in another way?
Yeah, there's a tension, and probably an unsolved tension, because in the first part of his brief text, Pignoria is trying to produce a sort of monogenetic and diffusionist theory of idolatry, which is actually problematic at that time, how to cross the Atlantic. But he's trying to propose some kind of theory about that. At the end of the 16th century, there's no certainty at the time on connection between the American and Asia. Bering is not, I mean, it was discovered, but there's not a certainty about if European people or Asian people could have passed in the Americas, etc. And he's trying to explore the possibility. He is not giving the last word about that, but he's, I mean, he noted that there's possibility to work on the presence of this of the appearance of this gesture, posture, bodies that are similar. I mean, could be analogy, but this is just a formal analogy from our point of view. I mean, the meaning of this gesture are completely different in different culture, but he's trying to find a way. And these are for him are the data from which history of religion should start. And he's not, I mean, I could say he's trying to propose the very idea that every kind of idolatry all over the world is coming from Egypt. Is not completely certain about how it reaches the different parts of the world, but there's many data there that happen at one point in time. There is another part of the text where Pignoria is just only proposing drawings by Ferroverde without text. I mean, he's satisfied with this Historia Sacra produced on Mesoamerican religion, but then he added images from Japan, images from India, etc., which are reproducing the same idea, visually the same idea. All these gods, and sometimes they are not gods, they are monks from Japan, there are other, Avalokiteshvara, which is a bodhisattva, not a god, which had many images that could be assimilated as God, as a new universal concept in this proto-scientific study of religion. So the idea is we have many data, the gods are similar all over the world, all are resembling to Egyptian images, which are not Egyptian, actually. The images they're studying are Roman interpretation of Egyptian religion, which is, of course, chaotic, but we could explore an historical explanation for that one. Pignoria proposes the idea that some time in somewhere, and there were some passage from the old world to the new world. We don't have any other explanation in Pignoria's work, but there's a possibility. So it's a sort of tension, yeah. This is a tension between a sort of the need of a monogenetic hypothesis and this general comparative model.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Susanna. Then maybe I want to ask a question myself from the art historical point of view. As an art historian, I was intrigued by your discussion of the visual methodology that Pignoria used, and I have one or two questions about that. First of all, the really basic question, you mentioned that Pignoria produced these images, these woodcuts. But in this period, it is usually that they work together, of course, with artists, and sometimes the printer selects the artist. And I think you mentioned a couple of times that that Pignoria himself comments on the images. So there is really a relationship in this case between him. He really has a say in how the images look. But I was wanting to know how the relation between the artist and Pignoria was, if we know anything about that, and if that changes anything.
Yeah.
And then maybe another broader question about the visual methodology. So discussing mostly now or exclusively the non-European gods, or non-gods, but almost gods from all the world except from Europe. But what does he do with the antique, with the ancient gods? I mean, is there also some change in those, or does he just take over? Is that he only works on the addendum, on the appendices that he works on? Yeah, that's maybe one thing, and then maybe a third question would be what would be the how unique is this visual methodology? I mean, if you look at other antiquarians at the same time, they make also use of images. Can you say that this is a unique way of doing this, or is he part of a larger context in which images play similar roles for other antiquarians at that time?
I start with the last one because it's the easy one to answer, because I really don't know. I mean, it's something that I have to develop in the future, trying to look within the antiquarian culture to see if there are other. I have a very general knowledge of the antiquarian culture, but I need to look at other example on works dedicated to gods in different contexts, if you see there's something similar. And at the same time, about ancient gods, the appendix dedicated to ancient gods is actually a sort of repertoire of objects. It's a typical antiquarian methodology. I mean, Pignoria is adding a large amount of different coins, little pieces of statues, and all the objects you could see in collection from friends and other correspondence. I hope that in the future some scholars in ancient religion could work on this text. I hope so. It is really needed, because there are many differences in the way Pignoria is work in comparison with Cartari's selection. As I said in the first part, Cartari has produced a very strange collection of images, because the images were produced by Zaltieri starting from the text. I mean, it's trying to illustrate the text. They don't have any direct experience of those gods they're representing. While on the other side, Pignoria is trying to reverse and the perspective is trying to look at proper material culture, to proper objects, and it's completely different. But regarding the production and the selection of Mesoamerican images, which is the only one that I could express something, there are different passages in the text that showing that Pignoria and Ferroverde are working together. Unfortunately, I didn't find any data or letters or information regarding the dialogues, but it's clearly evident that it's in a couple of texts that Ferroverde is accepting Pignoria's suggestion. There's a place where Pignoria is inverting the order of some images that are in a page of the Codex Vaticanus, and is writing a comment and is listing 4 names of gods. And then Ferroverde is reproducing the images in the order proposed by Pignoria and not the order of the Codex. So it's clearly evident that Pignoria could see the original images, but is following Pignoria's reflection. So that I could imagine that there is a sort of that Pignoria was leading the process and Ferroverde was responding. At the same time, actually, we don't know which part of the Codex Pignoria could see. We know that Pignoria didn't see the proper Codex, but probably some folios copied by a group of painters that were near to the Amulio in that year. Unfortunately, we didn't find these folios. I think that no Sonia Maffei, which produced a monograph on Pignoria, says nothing about this folio. I mean, probably they are lost, completely lost. But I have an idea, but it's just an idea, an hypothesis, that Pignoria could probably see just the first, how could I say, the first group of folio that are collected together with the quadernillo in Spanish, because probably when the Codex arrived in the Vatican Library was not already enquadernado, but they are just folios connected. So probably they were copied the first part of the first quadernillo, which is the cosmological part, and Pignoria could only that one. Only that one, because it's just using that one. It could have been used other images. For example, there are other images of Quetzalcoatl in other parts of the works, but it didn't use it. And at the same time, in the first edition of the work, Pignoria didn't realize that there is a proper codex in Vatican Library. It's just speaking about folios. It was only in the second edition of 1626 it was referring to a codex produced by Pedro de los Rios, etc., but it was an information that is taken from Philip van Binge, which is sending him some images. So it's not really seeing the codex, it's seeing just some copies of these images. So it's difficult to say if Pignoria is leading the process of selecting these images, or I don't know, it's complicated.
But maybe the artist also works from copies of the codex, also couldn't see the codex itself, probably, or maybe,
could be.
Yeah,
there are some information that some painters were working with the Cardinal Amulio in 65 and 66, were trying to copying some images, and we have, Davide Domenici found it in Venice. We have a copy of just the text, the Italian glosses of the text in a little book in Venice without images. It's trying to produce what? I don't know. I mean, there's that copying all the text to produce probably a copy of this part of the codex for I don't know, maybe to get.
Okay, great. Are there still questions, comments? Also, people at home on Zoom. If not, then I think that we can close. I mean, I want to thank again, first of all, Sergio Botta for his great presentation, and second of all people here in the audience for being here, for participating in this discussion, and also people at home. Thanks for being here. Not many left, but thanks. And people at the KNIR want to invite to have a drink with us here and to continue the discussion informally. So thanks again. We will have a next dialogue on the 15th of February, and then Hannah Malone will present her work. And she is our visiting professor from February onward for 3 months. So please, be there either here or on Zoom. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Many more questions about your visual methodology. Really,
Yeah.